Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning and salam sejahtera. Yang amat berbahagia, Tun Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, Malaysia's 4th Prime Minister and our Honourable Keynote Speaker. Yang berbahagia, Professor Emeritus Datuk Dr. Muhammad Zawawi bin Ismail, Chairman, Board of Director, Universiti Kebangsaan Malaysia. Yang berbahagia, Profesor Datuk Dr. Nur Azlan Ghazali, Vice Chancellor, Universiti Kebangsaan Malaysia. Timbalan-timbalan Naib Chancellor, Universiti Kebangsaan Malaysia. Yang berbahagia, Profesor Dr. Nur Ghani Mohamad Noor, Dean, Faculty of Economics and Management, Universiti Kebangsaan Malaysia. Members of Board of Directors, Universiti Kebangsaan Malaysia, Senior Officer of Universiti Kebangsaan Malaysia, Datuk-datuk, datin-datin, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Universiti Kebangsaan Malaysia and the Emerging Market Business Conference. Ladies and gentlemen, we are deeply honoured and privileged to have with us Yang amat berbahagia Tun Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, Malaysia's 4th Prime Minister, who has courteously consented to deliver a keynote address in today's conference. To Yang amat berbahagia Tun, we would like to extend our most heartfelt appreciation. Ladies and gentlemen, the Emerging Market Business Conference with the theme Reshaping Academia in the Rise of the Emerging Market is held in conjunction with a 2-week summit program involving exchange students from the Warsaw School of Economics and University of Warsaw, Poland, the University of Osaka, Japan, and 7 universities in Mexico, as well as local and international students from Malaysian universities. The conference aims to enhance the relationship between participants from different parts of the world in both academic and best practices by providing a platform to connect students with the real world to the sharing of knowledge on issues related to the growth of the new economic powers and the roles of business and economic graduates. We are deeply honored to have with us Malaysia's most prominent and experienced leaders, economists, and business figures who have kindly agreed to share their thoughts on the trends and challenges facing world economies, especially in the context of Malaysia. Before we move on, let us seek blessing of the Almighty. I would like to call upon Encik Muhammad Azim bin Madani to lead us in a doa recital.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Al-Fatihah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala asyrafil anbiya'i wal mursalin wa ala alihi washabihi ajma'in. Allahumma innaka khalaqul azim, innaka sami'ul alim, innaka ghafurur rahim, innaka rabbal arsyil azim, innaka rabbal jawadul karim. In the name of Allah, the most gracious and the most merciful, all praise is due to Almighty Allah, Lord of the worlds. May the peace and mercy of Allah be upon His Prophet Muhammad, his families, companions, and followers. On this glorious morning, in conjunction with the opening ceremony of the Emerging Market Business Conference, we uphold our hand to pray gratefully to thank on your infinite favor to us, till we can live in peace and harmony to perform our task as your servants. Ya Allah, we ask your blessing to make this occasion a success. Praise be to Allah, Lord of the universe. We seek of you the means of your mercy, the means of your forgiveness, the protection from all mistake, the benefit from all virtue, and the freedom from all sin. Ya Allah, give us good in this world and good in the hereafter, and save us from the torment of the hellfire. Rabbana alayka tawakkalna wa ilayka anabna wa ilaykal masir. Rabbana atina fid dunya hasanah wa fil akhirati hasanah wa qina azaban nar. Sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa barik wa sallim walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.
Thank you, Encik Muhammad Azim. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to invite Yang Berbahagia Profesor Datuk Dr. Nur Azlan Ghazali, the Vice Chancellor, to deliver the welcoming and opening address, as well as to introduce our honourable keynote speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, Yang Berbahagia Profesor Datuk Dr. Nur Azlan Ghazali.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And very good morning. Yang amat berbahagia Tun Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, Malaysia's 4th Prime Minister, and honourable keynote speakers. Yang berbahagia Professor Emeritus Dr. Muhammad Zawawi bin Ismail, Chairman Board of Director UKM, Deputy Vice Chancellors, faculty members, senior officers of UKM, participants of the conference, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed an honor for me to welcome all of you to the Emerging Market Business Conference organized by the Faculty of Economics and Management, University Kebangsaan Malaysia. The focus of this conference on the emerging market is timely, as the economic situation is becoming increasingly vulnerable to changes within the emerging markets. there has been significant debate on how to address the issues and challenges facing emerging markets in their transitions to be a fully developed nation. This conference is organized in conjunction with Emerging Market Business Summit 2014, a 2-week program organized for exchange students from University of Warsaw, Poland, Osaka University of Economics and Law, Japan, and 5 different universities from Mexico, including Colegio de Mexico, alongside Malaysian students from Faculty of Economics and Management, and also representatives from various other universities. Together with us, actually, in parallel to this program, we also have today, this morning, 50 students from all the 10 ASEAN nations that are involving in the ASEAN Youth Volunteer Programs, and also about 60 students coming from all over the world who participated in the UKM Global Mobility Program. So we have truly almost everybody from all continents and so many countries in this session. So welcome to UKM and welcome to Malaysia. The issue of emerging markets should not only be the concerns of governments and the private sectors. Students as future leaders and global citizens should also be aware of their roles and the implication of the changes in the emerging market. This conference indeed a very special one because Poland, Mexico, Malaysia are all listed as emerging markets on the MSCI Emerging Market Index and represent the emerging markets on 3 different continents who have come together here at UKM to learn and share what and how the transitions in our economy might impact us. This 2-week program aims to enhance academic leadership between universities in different parts of the world by giving the students the experience of Malaysian culture and academic ambience. To add value to their experience in Malaysia, this conference will give them the opportunity to listen, to learn, and to share their ideas with prominent figures and statesmen. In addition to this conference, students are visiting various agencies in Malaysia, like the Economic Planning Unit, the Bank Negara, Proton, various other industries, and students will also be staying with their foster parents in Ledang, Johor for 3 days in company with buddy Malaysian students from UKM. Today is a very special day for us. We are very fortunate today to have together with us the former Malaysian Prime Minister, Yang Amat Berbahagia Tun Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, to give the keynote address for this conference. Thank you very much, Tun, for accepting our invitation. Tun Dr. Mahathir needs no introduction to many of us. Tun is a person who is the architect of many of Malaysia's success stories. However, for the benefits of our participants from abroad, it is an honor for me to give a very brief introduction of Tun. Tun Mahathir, the 4th Prime Minister of Malaysia, held office for 22 years from 1981 to 2003. Under Tun's leadership, Malaysia experienced rapid transformation, privatizations of government enterprises, improvements of public infrastructure, transformation from agriculture-based economy to a manufacturing hub and export-led industries, and the implementation of many important landmark projects that have made Malaysia renowned in the world stage, including the Petronas Twin Towers, Putrajaya Administrative City, the Kuala Lumpur International Airport, KLIA, the North-South Highways, the Penang Bridge, the Smart Tunnel, and many, many more. And these landmarks have been featured by the History channels. Notable among Tun's many achievements is the remarkable way Tun steered the country during 97 and 98 ASEAN economic crisis that goes against the wishes of the international communities, especially the IMF. His unorthodox policies have since become mainstream. His ideas and economic prowess have stood the test of time and emulated by others. His farsightedness has helped Malaysia achieve commendable progress from a per capita income of USD $800 to USD $9,000, about tenfold increase during the period of 2 decades. Tun's leadership has also propelled Malaysia towards modernization on par with some of the developed and industrialized countries of the world. We owe this very much to Tun Dr. Mahathir's foresight, leadership, and wisdom. Let us applaud Tun for all this contribution to us and also to the future generations of Malaysia. On a more personal note, we are honored and proud that Tun Dr. Mahathir, one of the founders of this university, who has also served as chairman of the University Council in the early days of this university. So this is sirih pulang ke ganggang. Tun will be the first prominent statesman who will be giving a keynote speech in this dark yet special space, which we have called this area as the Persada Chancellery. Persada Chancellery launched on the 19th May of 2014, a couple of months back, in conjunction with the 44th anniversary of UKM. It's not just a physical space for forum, speeches, and discussions. Instead, what is more salient and significant are the ideas, the content, and the discussions generated at Persada Chancellery. Persada Chancellery aims to become a unique and important platform for discussions on national and global current issues affecting the life of our citizens and nation. As the National University, University Kebangsaan Malaysia, as the guardian of the nation, must at the forefront to move and motivate deliberations on all current and pertinent issues that confront our society and nation. UKM's academics and researchers must be front runners to spearhead discussion based on their research and expertise on national and global issues which affect us all. UKM must also synergize and mobilize expertise from all over, as well as the relevant people and authorities to deliberate on these issues at Persada Chancellery. To this end, Tun Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, a leading statesman, a charismatic leader, a visionary thinker, who has consistently voiced his views with conviction and clarity on issues affecting not only Malaysia, but the global citizenry, will be addressing us on this platform we proudly call Persada Chancellery. As we envision in the future, when Persada Chancellery deliberates, the nation listens intently and attentively. What more when the speaker is Tun Dr. Mahathir? Without further ado, I invite Yang Amat Berbahagia Tun Dr. Mahathir Mohamad to give his keynote speech. Thank you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Yang berbahagia Profesor Emeritus Datuk Dr. Muhammad Zawawi, Chairman, Board of Directors UKM. Yang berbahagia Profesor Datuk Dr. Noor Azlan Ghazali, Vice Chancellor Universiti Kebangsaan Malaysia. Timbalan-timbalan Naib Chancellor. Yang berbahagia Profesor Dr. Noor Ghani Matno, Dean Faculty of Economics and Management, members of the Board of Directors, UKM, senior officers of UKM, Datuk, Datin, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamualaikum and a very good morning to everyone. Firstly, I would like to say thank you very much to UKM for this invitation to speak on a subject that is current, that is about the changes taking place in the world today, especially the rise of emerging markets and the need for everyone actually, including academia, to make adjustments to this phenomenon, this rise of the emerging market. Now, I always find that in order to foresee the future, one has to look at the past, because the past indicates the trend that the future will take. For example, when we became independent in Malaysia, the population was only 5 million. When I became Prime Minister in 1981, the population had grown to 13 million. It stands to reason that the population would continue to grow, that there would be a bigger population for Malaysia in the future. And if we are going to do something, it must not be for 13 million, it must be for a greater number of people. And therefore, if we have to build infrastructure for the future, it must be designed for a population that is much bigger than the current population of 13 million. And indeed, Malaysia's population grew very fast, so that by the time I retired in 2003, that is after 22 years as Prime Minister, the population had doubled from 13 million to 26 million. It stands to reason that the population will continue to grow. Maybe at a slower rate, but it will continue to grow. And therefore, if we have to plan for the future, we have to take into consideration the increasing population of the country. Doing something to attend to current problems, current situation is not good enough. We have to plan for the future, and the future is going to be what the past indicated. There will be growth in population, and therefore that growth will continue. Now, in the field of human knowledge, we see the rise of university in the past. It all started with the need to study religion, both in the Muslim world and in the Christian world. Centers of learning were focused on the learning of religion because that was extremely important. The faith of the people was extremely important at that period in time. Later on, because of the need to produce thinkers and people with a bigger field of knowledge, to the study of religion was added the classics, the study of the writings of great authors, and the understanding of the philosophy of great philosophers of the past. So to the study of religion was added the study of the classics. Following upon that, there came a need to add other subjects to the study, to what the universities should teach. And this was, of course, subjects like history and geography and was added, followed by science. Then it was found necessary that people should be better educated in order to work. So the academic community realized that they must prepare people after they graduate, prepare the people to work in certain fields. And many of the subjects added were started with science, the need to understand science and how things function. And then it went on to take into consideration the kind of work that needs to be done. In America, they studied business. It was thought unusual because why should an intellectual understand business? He is going to do some philosophical thinking. But it was found necessary to teach business because business is what pushed the economy forward. And so the study of business became very important. And of course, from science, there came the study of engineering and other subjects to prepare people to take up their place in the community so as to ensure the progress of the community. You can see that all along, academia has responded to what is happening around. And if academia isolates itself and thinks only of studying the classics and things like that, it becomes irrelevant, and I think it will not grow. But now we see academia is very conscious about what is happening around it, and how can academia serve the community. And so we see today academia making adjustments to the surroundings. And the surroundings, of course, include the political changes, the economic changes, the changes in the application of technology, science, etc. Now, if the university, the academic members of the university wants to remain relevant, it must change to accommodate the needs of the community. And today's needs are that a country, we are seeing countries emerging. It all started with the Japanese. They were a very traditional nation with a very old culture. But they realized that in order to compete with the West, they must acquire the knowledge of the West and the systems that were found in the West. And so the Japanese started the first steps towards changing their system, their culture, their knowledge, in order to build a community that can compete with the West. And in this they succeeded. To a lesser extent, Thailand tried this also, but was not as successful as the Japanese. But today we see the Japanese as a model of a transition of a country that is traditionalist into a country that is compatible with the changes taking place around it. And so we see many Eastern countries and many other countries elsewhere too changing in order to be able to survive and prosper in a very rapidly changing world. So academia must cater to this. And what is happening today is that we are seeing a new set of countries coming up, becoming prosperous and taking part in the affairs of the world, including the trade that is going on throughout the world today. Today, we see almost a borderless world which has become globalized, and there is a need to cope with these changes, with these porous borders and speed of transportation and speed of communication. So this is a surrounding that will change us, and emerging countries, by adopting the new development in terms of science, technology, etc., emerging countries must find its way, find a niche in this new, very advanced, very technologically advanced situation. So it is important, of course, that apart from learning the sciences and other subjects, it must also accommodate the needs of emerging markets. What are emerging markets? suddenly we find that trade is very easy, simply because transportation means have improved tremendously. As an example, for this purpose, I would like to point out that at one time, at the time when Cheng Ho came to Malaysia, he had to sail 6 months before reaching Malaysia from China. Today it takes 3 hours. You can see the tremendous change that has taken place. And of course, if we don't adjust, we are thinking of our friends from China coming here in 6 months' time. We are going to be very embarrassed because he is going to be at our door 3 hours later. So this is the situation that affects us all today. How do we respond to the changes, and how do we make use of these changes in order to improve our economy, our competitiveness in a world that has become a village, a small world, where communication is so easy. We talk about hours. The furthest place from Malaysia, for example, is New York, which is 12 hours difference in terms of time. And it takes only 20 hours or 25 hours to fly from Kuala Lumpur to New York. This makes a tremendous difference to the way we respond. And academia must take this into consideration. If it fails to understand the changes, the technological changes that has taken place, then of course it becomes irrelevant. But seeing that many of the smaller countries have now decided that they should develop their economy, they should benefit from the ease of communication, the ease of transportation, academia must see how it can help the process so that the emerging markets will not just be markets, it will of course be also participating in producing goods for other markets. We used to be markets for the products of other countries. In the past, when we were under colonial rule, our duty was to produce raw material, cheap raw material like rubber and tin, and this raw material would be sent to the West, where value would be added, it would be processed, and then the products would be sent back to us. It stands to reason that if we acquire the technology, there would be no necessity to send our raw material to Europe in order to be processed and sent back to us. Why cannot we do it ourselves? And we have discovered that we can. We can do these things by ourselves. Sometimes with maybe an increase in cost initially, but eventually the cost will be reduced and the local market and the foreign market will accept our products. So academia must realize this and must make the necessary changes to enlighten the students and the community you have to enlighten the students on the changes that are taking place and how these changes will affect the students and the community so that their response would be positive towards the changes taking place. Now, changes taking place not always under our control. They take place simply because of certain development. For example, the development in transportation has reduced the size of the world, where before you take 6 months, you take 3 hours now. So there must be a radical change in the way we do things, in the way we produce things, in the way we trade. We can actually today use our handheld telephone to look at the products that are being sold 12,000 miles away from our country and make a decision, look at it in 3 dimensions, make a decision whether to buy or not to buy. Of course, on the other hand, we have products that can be sold on a market through this gadget, this telephone. How do we make use of it? Can we benefit from it? This is something that we have always to be thinking about, because technology is changing so very fast. Not so very long ago, it was impossible for a phone call to be made from one car to another car. But today, you can talk to someone who's in a car in New York as if he is just next door. The voice, the sound of the voice, you can recognize because the communication, the system is so very good. The transmission is so very good that you can actually recognize the voice of the person speaking to you 12,000 miles away. That is the radical change that has taken place. So how do we benefit from this change? Academia must learn to work out how you can understand the system, how you can apply the system, and of course, having understood, to work out new syllabus for the teaching of the environment that is affected by the new environment that we live in. I'm quite sure that most members of academia understand this, but some are of course held back because of some other consideration. Politics, for example, we have instances of extreme nationalism, a nationalism that is narrow and unable to appreciate the changes that are taking place around. A university is a place where you acquire knowledge, not just to learn how to speak your language, but to acquire knowledge. And knowledge comes to us in many languages. So we need to master languages as well. If you keep on saying that, well, we must promote only our language and not learn other languages, we will be depriving ourselves of knowledge, because knowledge comes to us not in our language but in a foreign language. If you go back historically, you'll see the development, for example, of knowledge in the world community in the past. We know that the Greeks were great philosophers and great scientists. The Indians were great mathematicians. Now, when Islam came to the world, the first verse of Islam promotes reading. Iqra, read. When you read, you acquire knowledge. But what do you read? That is important. If you read and acquire knowledge, you must read something that is new to what you already know. And so the early Muslims decided to study Greek and the language of India in order to acquire the knowledge of the Greeks, their philosophy and their science, so that the Muslims can be as well developed as the Greeks. Of course, later on, having studied, having done research, they translated all this knowledge, which was very small in those days, into their own language. And over time, the Arabic language became the language of knowledge. It was that knowledge that built the great Muslim civilization. At that time, Europe was going through the dark ages. The dark ages because they were very, very conservative. Learning was confined only to the priests. Books were actually locked so that nobody else can have access to the knowledge in the books. This was the situation in Europe at that time. But having watched the progress made by the Muslim civilization, the European Christians decided that they need to know what is it that makes this civilization so great. And what they did, of course, was to learn Arabic. We cannot imagine it now, but at one time, Arabic was the language of the people of Spain, which was called by the Arabs Al-Andalus. They spoke Arabic all the time, the Spanish Christians even. And so the priests decided to acquire the knowledge of the Muslims available in the libraries in Cordoba and in other places. And from there, they embellished their Renaissance, the European Renaissance, the rebirth of the European civilization. And you can see that the knowledge that they gained from the Arabs in the Arabic language contributed much towards the Renaissance. And it is therefore important to learn the language of the people with the knowledge, because then only you can acquire the knowledge. Of course, unfortunately, even as the Europeans were learning the knowledge available in the Arabic language, the Muslims themselves decided that it was not necessary, there is no merit in studying anything else other than the religion. And so the great Muslim scientists disappeared from the scenes to be replaced by great theologians who interpreted the teachings of Islam and the religion only. So you see, after the acquisition of knowledge from the Arabs, the Europeans made tremendous progress in the field of science, in the field of other fields of knowledge, whereas the Muslims regressed because they did not study science anymore. They did not study geography or history, but they were focused entirely on the study of the religion. That divergence between the Islamic civilization and the European civilization can be seen in what we see the world today, that the Muslims are backwards in terms of many things, whereas the Europeans have now gone into outer space, they have landed on the moon, and they are going to land people on Mars. They can fly into outer space and do all kinds of things, which comes through the knowledge that they initially acquired from the Muslims. There is a man called Ulugh Beg from Uzbekistan who studied the stars, and his mapping of the stars is still relevant today as it was some 400 years ago. So much of the knowledge that has enabled the progress of European civilization came initially from the Muslim world, but the Muslims themselves decided that this knowledge will not give you merit, so there's no point in studying that. So when a decision like that is made, it has tremendous repercussions. Today we are beginning to realize that we need this knowledge, and we need this knowledge in order to be able to compete in a world that is changing. If we are going to be competing with the rest of the world, we must be as progressive in terms of knowledge as the rest of the world. Now we are seeing more interest in the sciences, in other subjects other than just religion. Of course, they must study religion, but they must not neglect the other sciences. And this is something very important for Malaysians especially to understand. The need to learn from other people the knowledge that they have developed or acquired, because without learning from them, we will be left far behind. And in terms of our development, obviously this will be very much affected. We have to understand the changes taking place for us before we can make the necessary adjustment. If you don't understand what is taking place outside, around us, it is like being blind. A blind man cannot respond to what is seen in light because he cannot see. But if you cut yourself off from the changes taking place in the environment, you will be like a blind man, unable to respond adequately to the changes taking place simply because you cannot see the changes. So academia must appreciate the changes taking place in the world today, not only with regard to the market, but other things which affect the market as well. For example, political changes. We know of the radical changes that took place with the introduction of the socialist and communist ideology. At a time when workers were exploited, it was thought that the solution to the exploitation of workers was to have everything controlled by the state. The state should own all the means of production. This is the belief of the communists, that they should nationalize all means of production, and therefore they should earn all the profits from the industry, and with the profit they can share it equally among the workers and not be given to investors and owners only. But it didn't work. It didn't work because when you acquire the means of production, the means of production becomes worthwhile only if there are people, there are markets to sell what you produce. But if the market is poor, the market is made up only of workers, then the expensive products that you produce cannot be sold to the market which is made up of very poor people. And when that happens, the only way around was to reduce the price of the goods that you produce, because the market cannot bear the high price. And when you reduce the price of the goods, you don't make any profits. When you cannot make any profits, there is nothing to distribute. It took the Soviet Union, for example, 70 long years to understand that the system doesn't work. The central planning, the nationalization of the means of production did not work. And it took a brave man to reject it, and he did it only after he became the president of the Soviet Union, because if he tried to do it earlier, he would certainly be arrested and probably executed. So that is how changes take place, solutions take place, which sounds very good at the time, but eventually it has to be realized that it doesn't work. Now we have come to believe in the free market, in the free movement of capital. But when you believe in the free market, because the control market has failed, you think that just by being free, you would solve the problem. So everybody can invest, but then you have problem of monopolies and other things and the greed of people, which has resulted in the crisis that is experienced by America and Europe today. The free market, even though it is good, but when it is abused, will produce bad results. We have to learn from this so that our markets will not be too free, nor should it be too controlled by the state. You have to find a medium way, and this is where academics can play a role, because academics by nature are thinkers. They have to think, and when they think about the pros and cons of nationalization against privatization, they will see that while both nationalization and privatization can bring about good changes and benefit the community, but when they are abused, you will meet with a lot of negative results. And the negative results we are seeing today is what is happening in Europe and America, where there is no restraint on the market at all. This was proposed by President Reagan, who said that there should be less government, that the market should control itself, should regulate itself. It was a great idea, but the markets are not about regulating itself. The market is about making as much money as possible, and if they can find a system to make money for themselves, they do not care about what happens in the end. And they are, as you know, today they don't resist monopolies, etc. And because of that, the free market has not delivered as they believe it would deliver for the community. These are subjects for academics to study. Why has the free market failed? Why did the nationalized, centralized economy system fail? And if you study this carefully, you will, I'm quite sure you will come to some conclusion which can benefit the society at large. But at the moment, we are still struggling with commitment. The commitment to the free market is such today that you cannot question it. You have to accept that the free market is what is good for the world, is the best system in the world. And yet, we see the free market failing. All these things are going to affect newly emerging markets. You have an opportunity to learn from the mistakes of others and to learn from the good results of others. If you do not notice the mistake and you adopt 100% of their system, the chances are that the emerging markets will go through turmoil and will recede in the end. This is an important subject for academics to study and to make comparisons between one system and the other, and maybe there will be a third system or fourth system. But generally, we have to contend with greedy people, greed. There was one man who was dealing in junk bonds who said, greed is great. Now, we all say that greed is not good, and yet there is a man who says greed is great. And of course, the result of being greedy is the collapse of the Western market that we see today. So one has to contend with human emotions as well, not just system. Systems do contribute. Without system, I don't think we can have achieved a good growth. But we have also to contend with greed, the emotions that motivate people to do things which may be good or may be bad. That is for the academics to study and to analyze and to reach some conclusion. Unfortunately, when academics study anything at all, there will be differences between them. So there will be a need for others to make a choice as to whether one idea is better than the other. Normally, you'll find that it is halfway between. Both ideas are good and both ideas are bad. But how do you determine what is good and what is bad? Because you need to extrapolate into the future. As it grows, what happens? And see, as happens with the communist ideology of state ownership of all the means of production, in the end, the result is poverty for all. Equality, yes, but it is the equality of poverty, not the equality of the rich or the wealthy. Simply put, the idea that everybody should be paid the same amount of money for whatever work he does, so as to be equal, is not workable. If you pay everybody the same pay, then nobody will undertake the more onerous or the more responsible work, because why should he bear this responsibility when others are getting paid the same amount without the responsibility? If I can extrapolate this into everyday life, supposing everybody must be paid the same pay. Of course, professors and lecturers pay the same pay. I don't know whether you like it or not, but I'm quite sure you wouldn't like it. But if you want to pay your driver the same pay as you pay yourself, you'll be very poor. Because whatever you earn will go to the driver, because he must earn as much as you earn. This is hypothetical, of course, but that is the kind of thing that will happen if we try to push equality to the extreme. We have to accept that people with different responsibilities will have different rewards or different salaries, etc. So here you need to study in depth when the emerging market develops, which model must it follow? Should it follow completely the Western model, or should it develop its own model, or should there be other models that we should, the emerging market should copy? You know that Malaysia at one time, and even now, has decided that we should look east. That was a choice. We were looking west because the west represented wealth and progress. But instead of just looking at the west, we decided we should look east. Why did we look east? It is a question of evaluation. The west was actually in decline. People don't want to notice it, but it was already in decline. The east was rising. So if we don't look at the east, we look only at the west, then there would be a decline. We tried to reason why the west has gone into decline. It's gone into decline because of the ideas about equality, that everybody should be equal to each other. That doesn't work because, for example, workers in the west refuse to do work that is considered beyond the amount that they were paid to work. They kept on demanding more pay, less work, more pay, less work. And this eventually resulted in their products becoming too costly to compete with the East, where people were working very hard to rebuild their economy and were paid less but were producing more. And in that kind of situation in the market, in the world market, the Eastern countries won hands on against the West. And the West, as you know, has gone into decline, and the East today is rising. So the emerging markets must learn from the mistakes made by the West and also the success of the East in taking advantage of their knowledge in order to grow their economy. Today we have a situation where an attempt is being made to open up markets for the whole world. That markets should be free, that capital can go in and out of market freely. There should be no restriction, there should be no laws to restrict the movement of capital. It sounds very good because poor countries would need the capital to come from other countries. And this was what Malaysia did. We decided on FDI, foreign direct investment, long before the word FDI was known to other parts of the world. We decided to invite foreigners to come and invest in our country at a time when we had just obtained independence. Normally, on being independent, countries do not like to call back the former colonial masters to come and do whatever in their country. But we went the other way. At the time when other people were rejecting foreign investment, we invited foreign investments to come in here. And because of the injection of capital from foreign investors, Malaysia grew. But if we allow this thing to go on until there is no investment by locals at all, then obviously we would be under the control of the investors. If they pull out, our economy will collapse and they will have a stranglehold on us. So we have to balance that with local investment. Whether this is being done or not, I wouldn't be able to say. But we learned from the East that while they were willing, they were keen to acquire the technology of the West, but they built their own industries. Inferior at first, but eventually their industries produce quality goods. So there is something to be learned in the East. It is for us to study this phenomenon. Today we see, for example, in Japan, Japan is almost in decline. And I was asked, I was in Japan recently, I was asked, do you still look east at Japan because we are not doing well? Well, the answer to that is that we have to look east at Japan to know why they do not do well. We must learn from their mistakes as much as we must learn from their success. You see, so I told the Japanese quite openly, we were studying, and they asked me, what is wrong with them? I said, you want to follow America too much. That is a problem. Where before Japan was known as Japan Incorporated, there is good working relation between government and private sector. Then they were told that Japan Incorporated is wrong. So now they persecute or prosecute government officers who try to help the private sector. And because they broke away, the government did not help the private sector, there is a decline which Japan has not been able to overcome just yet. We, on the other hand, watching what happens to Japan after it discarded the Japan Incorporated concept, we decided that working relations, good working relations between government and private sector is good for us. So we actually adopted what is regarded as wrong in Japan. We became Malaysia Incorporated. It's a government policy to make Malaysia a country where the private sector works closely with the public sector or the government. And I think that has helped us avoid the mistakes made by Japan, where they broke away. They stopped the working relations between the government and the private sector. Now, why did we adopt something that was condemned by the West as wrong. Japan Incorporated was wrong. Our reason is that the government gets money from the private sector. Now, if the private sector fails, does not make any profit, how can the government collect taxes? If all the private sector people fail in their business, we cannot get any tax. And the government will be weak, will be poor, will not have enough money to even administer the country. So we adopted the Japan Incorporated concept and called it Malaysia Incorporated. And the explanation is very simple. If we help the private sector to make profits, 28% of that profit belongs to the government by way of corporate tax. We were working for the corporate tax, our part of the profits. So although we were helping the private sector make money, but a part of that money, the profit they make, belongs to the government. We are working for the government. So why shouldn't we work with the private sector? It's a analysis that we came by because we make this observation of what was happening in Japan. Once they stopped being Japan Incorporated, Japan went into a state of decline. We adopted Malaysia Incorporated as a concept. We were able to continue our growth. Maybe not as fast or as high as Japan, but still we avoided the decline that has taken place in Japan. So an idea may sound bad or be made to sound bad by some parties, but it may actually be good if you study the effects or the results very carefully. Now, when Japan was accused of having Japan Incorporated, the accusation came from the rivals of Japan. Obviously, it is not good for Japan, it's good for the rivals. So, we need to study the effects of whatever ideas that comes from market rivals to any country to find out whether it is good for the country or not. Currently, we are in the process of studying the TPPA, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It is glorified as a great step towards free trade. Actually, it is a great step towards unfree trade, because you have to conform, you have to follow the agreements that you have made. So if you have to follow some agreement, obviously you are not free. Currently, you can trade and do anything you like with any country, but once you enter into an agreement on free trade, you are governed by that agreement, and therefore you are no longer free. Now that has to be discussed to see the pros and cons, to find out whether new ideas, new proposals are indeed good for us or bad for us. Every proposal that comes from outside needs to be studied very carefully, and I think this is also the task of academia. They must study this and they must participate in the arguments on whether a new idea is good or bad for a country like us, which is emerging. We are not yet a developed country, we are emerging. It is very important that we choose the right policy, the right approach to doing anything if we want to sustain the market and grow it. So these are the things that they are the responsibility of the government, but they are also the responsibility of academia, because it is important that academia must be able to teach the right things, or at the very least to present both sides of the picture so that people can make a choice as to which one would be good for countries which are now emerging as players in international economy in this world. So I will stop there. I believe you want to ask questions, so I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Tun, for a very interesting keynote address. I dare not to summarize this because it covers everything in economics that I learned in my first year till my PhD program. Can I now invite, this is a very special moment and a very precious moment. Tun has agreed to receive a couple of Q&A. We will max it to only 5 questions. Why don't you come first?
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I am Isti Toka from Indonesia. Thank you very much for this precious opportunity. Okay, I will ask about the development of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. The thing that I want to answer is about in the past, Russia, the former of USSR, and also China were felt in socialism and communism about the economic system like you've already explained. But then, okay. So sorry. Okay.
Yes, Russia and China.
Yeah, Russia and China. Nah, but today, BRICS are very developing and emerging, and they also plan to establish the so-called bank, which is almost look like World Bank. So what's your opinion? Will be they are successful in the future and survive because 2 of those members were felt in the past, Russia and China. And if they are collapsed, the problems will be like domino effect for all over the world. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Well, Russia is a great producer of natural gas, and most of the gas is sold to Europe. But Russia and Europe do not agree on political matters. They take a different stand, and it is quite obvious that the NATO nations in Europe would like to pressure Russia into not doing a lot of things which Russia wants to do. So, because Europe is dependent upon Russian gas, Europe is vulnerable. And what happens lately, of course, is that Russia has decided to stop the supply of gas to Europe. This is a very important energy source for Europe, and Europe will find itself unable to generate enough power for itself. But on the other hand, Russia also needs to sell the gas. If Russia doesn't sell the gas, it will become very, very poor. So Russia needs a new market. And that was why Russia was willing to sell to China at a price, I think, which is lower than the price they charge Europe. But this gives Russia an alternative. Once Russia has an alternative, then Russia feels free to follow its own agenda with regard to the rest of the world. That is why Russia and China, who were sometimes friends and sometimes enemies, have decided that they will work together with each other in order to reduce Russia's dependence upon Europe. And this gives both Russia and China freedom to act and implement their own agenda. That is basically the reason why Russia and China has now come close together. Is because of the pressures coming from Europe and from America. Economically, of course, it is good for Russia, although it will earn less from China than it earns from Europe. Europe will have problem with energy. They will have to buy the oil from other countries. And despite the fact that America today produces shale oil, and the price of gas and oil should come down, it has not come down. It has not come down because Europe needs to buy oil. And the price, when you have a demand, then the price of oil stays high. So that's the present situation. Otherwise, if Russia continues to supply oil to Europe and America produces shale oil, the price of oil will go down very, very far, and that will affect us because we need to sell some of our gas, if not our oil. So the friendship is based, the reconciliation between China and Russia is because of economic needs of both. China needs power. It has 1.4 billion people, and they are growing very fast. They are becoming richer, and rich people use more energy than poor people. So China needs more sources of fuel from a neighbor, a land-based neighbor. On the other hand, China depends today on what is coming from the Gulf, and that means transportation by ship, passing through the Straits of Malacca and going up to China. Supposing something happens along the way, then China will be deprived of a source of fuel. So for China, this is good to work with Russia. Economically, it is good. Also, of course, it has some political significance in that the pressure that is being applied against China from the Pacific side will be mitigated by China not being too dependent upon sources of fuel or energy from the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I invite second questions?
Sure. My name is Piotr. I'm a student at Warsaw School of Economics. I would like to refer to your tenure as a Prime Minister, if I may. So I would like to ask what were the main economic challenges for Malaysia in the 80s, whether it was inflation, unemployment, what was the stance of academia at this time, and how did you make sure that the economic growth at that time was sustainable?
This is about Malaysia in 1980s?
Malaysia in the 80s, and how you make the growth to be sustainable.
Well, thank you very much. Well, we decided that we should not be, be friendly only with the West. Although we had a relation with the West because of being colonies, our orientation is actually westwards. But we found Japan is growing very fast. Korea was growing, and later on Taiwan and China also was growing. So they must be doing something right. So we formulated the Look East policy. Now the Look East policy is not about getting Japanese investments into Malaysia. It's about learning not only the knowledge of the Japanese, but the work ethics of the Japanese. Work ethics is extremely important. Culture or value system is what determines whether a people can develop well or can regress. If you have the wrong work ethics, if you have wrong value system, you will not be able to make progress. So we wanted to learn from the Japanese. What is it that drives the Japanese to recover after their destruction during the last war? They were almost totally flattened by the last war, and yet they recovered so fast that within a short period, they became the second biggest economy in the world. There must be something right that they were doing. So we wanted to learn from them. And we sent our students there, we sent our workers there to learn about their work ethics, about their systems and their culture. And as a result of learning from the Japanese, we were able to achieve better growth than most other countries which became independent after the last war. It is the work ethics of the Japanese. One particular aspect of the Japanese culture is the strong feeling of shame. For the Japanese, if you do something that is shameful, they would rather kill themselves than face the world. they would commit harakiri. That is the Japanese culture. But of course nowadays they don't commit harakiri, but they jump off buildings. And as you know, recently, when a Japanese scientist presented some paper which was false, he committed suicide recently. Because the Japanese feeling of shame is very strong. When you have a strong feeling of shame, you do not want to do anything that is shameful. If you are given a job to do, you must do it well so that you can be proud of what you do. That is why if you see Japanese handicraft, they are so very, very fine. Because for them, pride comes with good quality. Whereas if you fail to produce the best, you feel ashamed. You don't have to commit harakiri, but you feel ashamed all the same. So this is what we learn from them. But unfortunately, Malaysians do not feel tak malu lah. You see, we don't feel as strongly as they do. But I think some people do. Some of those who sent to Japan to study, they have a stronger feeling that they have to succeed in order not to feel ashamed of themselves. So this contributed much, this culture contributed much towards the growth of Malaysian economy. But of course, along the way, you need to understand how economies function. If you are not able, well, you don't have to be an economist. If you are an economist also is bad, because economists tend to follow what the book says, you see. So when you have someone who is unorthodox, he is likely to make decisions which economists will condemn, but sometimes it works. So that's how we escaped in 1997, 98. The economists all told us that if you do this, the country will go bankrupt. But we were not restrained by orthodox economy. So we did something that was unorthodox. It saved us, and today what was unorthodox is now regarded as orthodox, and other people are doing what we did the last time. So we had problems, but every problem has got to be studied in order to overcome. Fortunately for us, we were able to overcome many problems in this multiracial, multi-religious country. Not the easiest country to develop or to rule, but fortunately for us, we were able to find the correct solutions to our problem. Thank you.
Please introduce yourself.
Good morning, Prime Minister. I am Jose Mateo de la Cruz from the University of the Philippines, also a member of the ASEAN Youth Volunteer Program. I would like to ask about your prospects and your ideas about the ASEAN economic integration. And if you were Prime Minister now, what are your thoughts about this integration?
Very challenging question.
If I were the Prime Minister now, I would resign. Well, I think ASEAN has great potential, tremendous potential, but there is too much politics which divide us, which push us in the wrong direction. We need the whole region to be peaceful and to work closely together. We tried. There was a time when we decided that each country, at that time there were only 5 members of ASEAN, that each country should have one major industry. And we will take shares in all the industries. For example, if a country is the host, then that country will take 60% of the share, and 40% will be divided between 10 each for each country. It was a great formula. So Malaysia was given the production of fertilizer. Indonesia also had this project. but the others did not follow through. So there were only 2 industries. Unfortunately, there was no sharing. Singapore felt that it was not necessary for them. So we had only 2 industries, and yet the formula was fantastic. Imagine a steel industry in the Philippines supplying steel to the whole of ASEAN. You have a huge market. You are bound to succeed. But if every country has a steel mill, the market in each country is too small to support the industry, and you will fail. So working together is what will help us. But now we have 10 countries, and we have 600 million people. They are not very rich, but still 600 million people have got a lot of needs. Now if one country is allocated certain products and produce for 600 million people, there will be a big market for that industry. And the other countries will have different industries also for the 600 million people. You will be as big as China. 600 million is half the population of China. Why is China succeeding? It's because it has a market, a domestic market of 1.4 billion poor people, but still the numbers count. They need certain things. So if we can work together, then I think ASEAN will succeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think due to the time schedule that we have, we now come to the end of it. You are right, Tun. Me, myself, being an economist, actually, it's not enough. That's why in UKM now, starting from next semester, we are introducing a new program, what we call Chitra UKM, where economists must also understand Sharia, economists has also to understand nanotechnology and many, many other things. Now, thank you very much for a very interesting keynote. Before we end, shall I just want again to acknowledge the international participants that we are having here. As I mentioned earlier, there are students coming from various countries. I just would like to mention some of the universities that are participating in the 3 programs that we are having concurrently. We have reps from Chiang Mai University, Fujian Catholic University, Daegu Health College from Korea. We have about 13 universities from Mexico, which I dare not to pronounce, so difficult to pronounce them. And then we have Lyceum University of Philippines University, HTTP University from Ankara, from Turkey, Kainan University, and many, many others. And in addition to that, the ASEAN Youth Volunteer Program, there are 50 students coming from all universities, all countries of ASEAN, including Myanmar, Philippines, and all of them. So again, thank you very much. Can I please call the floor to stand up for the applause to a very great keynote to Tun.